Dr. Williams, it's great to meet you in person today, and I'm particularly excited to meet you because I'm from South Africa and I'm familiar with some of the work you've been doing. So I'm going to start by asking you a bit more about what you do and how did you get into this line of work?
Oh my gosh, you said you're from South Africa. I have an interest in your background and what you do. But my name is Damon Williams, as you said, and for more than 20 years, I've been engaged in research, leadership related to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but from an organizational change perspective. You know, I'm not the person that has done all this work on the problem. I'm not this person that's done all this work on the challenge. I've always tried to live my life and my career dedicated to developing solutions. So what's the strategy? What's the approach? How do we go from where we are here to where we ultimately want to go? And that's what my career has been about for 20 years, whether it was as a student leader, or as a program assistant, or a director, or an assistant chancellor, a vice chancellor, or even a national and global vice president through the work I've had a chance to do around the world. So it's always been at the core, issues of diversity, inclusion, and organizational change, trying to make the world better for somebody else.
Okay, so how did you get into this line of work, or you basically were always in this line of work?
It's probably better said
right.
the way you said it the second time.
Okay.
I've always been really engaged with these issues of access and opportunity. I grew up in the inner city of Dayton, Ohio, right on the west side of Dayton. I grew up in an urban environment with all the classic dynamics that you have in an urban environment. Crack house on this corner, crack house on that corner, but a tremendous amount of love in the middle. Had an amazing mother, amazing father who raised me and really shaped my value system. But my life changed abruptly when I went away to boarding school. I grew up in an all African-American context, and one of the things that we know in this country is that most of our neighborhoods are what we refer to as hyper-segregated, right? Meaning that black folks live in communities with black folks, white folks with white folks, Latinos with Latinos, so on and so forth, and that is even irrespective of economic background. Massey and Denton talk about that. But when I went away to boarding school, I went from an all-black African-American context to a boarding school where I was one of only 8 African-Americans, Western Reserve Academy, and it was there where I really first encountered diversity. In fact, I think you're Indian, perhaps. Is that correct? Okay,
yes, I am.
Good call,
yes.
right? All right. So my first roommate, actually, one of the first individuals I became friends with at boarding school was actually Indian. And so here I am, 15, 16 years old, and I am coming to understand Indian culture, Hindi culture, Muslim culture, Jewish culture, differences of economic background. I never forget when we dropped me off, because we weren't a family of privilege, we were a family of hard work. We got dropped off, and I saw all these cars with funny names. And I later came to find out that the car that had the cat on the hood was a Jaguar, and the car with the funny blue and white emblem was a BMW. And when I saw a Porsche, it just changed my life. But I didn't know what any of those things were when I went away to school.
Right.
And so it was there where I first encountered diversity, but I also first encountered what it meant to be an outsider versus an insider. And it was the first time where I really started thinking about organizational culture. And are cultures inclusive? Are they exclusive? Do individuals feel a sense of belonging and connection? Are individuals receiving mentorship, right, from faculty, from staff? Those ideas hit me very early on at 15 through the wonderful relationships I had with my faculty, but also through the difficult challenges of being one of only 8 African Americans, being
right.
from a different economic background. That was the moment in which my interest and my passion for diversity, inclusion, and change was really incepted. And from there, at every single point, whether it was in undergrad or grad school, in my professional roles, I've always been interested and passionate about these issues of diversity, inclusion, but just kept getting successively to higher levels. I like to say I'm the student leader who grew up and kept doing the work, or I'm the student activist who grew up and kept doing the work. And as someone who's been an administrator and who's paid for those sins by students protesting me, I now know what I was all about and the mistakes that I made when I was young, but I've always been involved with this work.
Okay, and I also understand you're a Star Wars fan. You talk about the Force a lot.
Okay, you must have been stalking my YouTube channel
yes,
or something.
You got me.
All right. You know, so I am a big fan of Star Wars and always has. And a lot of people around the country, they know me in my work. And sometimes I'll talk about science fiction, right? So I used to give this lecture called Diversity, Science Fiction, and Organizational Change. And inside of that work, I would use these central metaphors of Star Trek or Star Wars or The Matrix to talk about how organizations needed to change themselves in various different ways. And so the Star Wars metaphor was really always about energy. and the Force. And so in the Star Wars mythology, you've got the Jedis who have an ability to capture energy that's around them and focus that energy in different types of ways and do all types of cool stuff. Well, I'm a believer that leaders have an ability to capture energy that exists in their environment and then shape that energy in a particular direction. And that was really why I wanted to create the National Inclusive Excellence Leadership Academy, was to create a space, a Jedi Academy, as it were,
right,
for leaders to come and to understand when you have a diversity crisis that happens, right? When something occurs, how do you take that moment and then grab it and pull it in and then shape it and harness it and use it to the good, right? Use it positively. How do you respond in ways that are not going to cause more negative ripple effects, but how do you respond in ways that say, okay, now we've got some new energy in the system, we can get some great things done, we can level up our agenda. Or when you don't have those things happening, but you have a chance to just move forward in a strategic way and marshal energy and marshal force to get things done, whether it's in the face of crisis or not. And that's what my National Inclusive Excellence Leadership Academy is all about. I know I'm jumping ahead in the interview because you told me when to go there, but that's what it's all about.
Okay.
And it's a Jedi Academy.
So tell me more about this Jedi Academy. Tell me about the Leadership Academy and how you came up with the idea, what trends inspired you. I'd love to know more.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, for the last several years, I was at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and I left that role about 4 years ago, about a year ago after having been there for 4 years. And when I say that opportunity to serve 4 million vulnerable youth, 4 million diverse youth, to work with incredible leaders all across this country to help expand access and opportunity and create a new generation of leaders, it honestly was the greatest honor I ever had. But when I went to do that, I walked away from my career in higher education. And so in my career in higher ed, I was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I was vice provost and chief diversity officer and a whole bunch of titles in addition to that. But I had just authored my book, Strategic Diversity Leadership and the Chief
right
Diversity.
here.
Yes, perfect product
I was
placement,
gonna ask you
right?
about it next.
Absolutely. So I had wrote those books and I walked away from what we were doing with that work and still kept my foot in the conversation and really from a different place, because when you're working in the K through 12 environment, what's great about it is it allowed for me to fulfill something that was deep inside of me. I always felt like my work in higher education, I was too late. I was too late to create true access for vulnerable communities. I was too late to expand the pipeline for students interested in STEM. I was too late to help young people to understand how to harness their interests in certain topics and drive it towards their purpose. I was too late in higher ed. So in going to do that work in the youth development space, working with pre-college communities, I had a chance to really go deep in that. And I'm a huge believer that when we step out of our comfort zone, right, and you step into a new reality, into a new space, that's where the developmental journey really begins. That's when you truly start to become your greatest self. And so I was so impacted by that. I saw so much poverty. I saw so much hope. I saw so much resilience. And when I stepped away, I knew I wanted to return to my work around diversity and inclusion and change, focused in higher ed. But I also wanted to expand it to my work in the corporate sector. I had worked with national partners like Taco Bell and Disney and Comcast and Microsoft, and the names go on. And so I learned a lot in those spaces. And now I come back to this work with what I refer to as an ecosystem perspective, right? So all the pieces are connected, right? It's not this silo and this silo and this silo, but if we're truly gonna make a difference in terms of creating access and opportunity and really overturning the inequality that we see in our country and truly making America great for all, right? To use the words of the day, then we've really gotta start thinking about the system as hyper-connected and really working inside of that to make great things happen. And so I left the Boys and Girls Clubs of America and I launched my National Research Center, and we went on tour, and I'm still on tour and visiting different places, and the webinar series touched 15,000 leaders. But the thing I'm probably most excited about now is the National Inclusive Excellence Leadership Academy, which is the 4-week online leadership program, which gives me a chance to connect and to partner with leaders all across the country who want to level up in their abilities. Leaders who are impatient for the slow progress of change. Leaders who are humble to understanding that we have to self-improve if we're going to make the world better. Leaders who understand the importance of being connected with others who are on a similar journey. And so the goal of the project is to bring together a community of leaders to help them in this way. I'm so excited for the first cohort. We had over 150 applicants.
It's incredible.
Oh, I was blown away. Blown away. And And we got 85 leaders in the first cohort from amazing institutions: Syracuse, MIT, Ohio State, Whitman College, Motlow Community College, Miami University, University of Michigan, WPI, RPI. I mean, it was overwhelming that leaders trusted enough to want to come on this journey. And so we actually launched the Academy up in the next couple of days. So I'm really excited, and it's just going to be amazing.
Wow, there are so many more questions I want to ask you right now. But first of all, tell me about air, because I know you say that diversity needs air to breathe, so I'd love to know more about that.
Look, I tell you, I love people to do their homework beforehand. I really appreciate that. So air is a concept that I came up with, and it actually emerged a bit after I had authored Strategic Diversity Leadership, which is kind of the lead book in my strategy set on D&I, diversity and inclusion work. But what I really wanted to hone into was what were the key themes, the key principles that leaders needed to be aware of to really move their diversity plans, right? So whether you're talking about the scenario that happened with Starbucks and then they came with the diversity training afterwards, or you're talking about the scenario that happened not too terribly long ago with Yale University, or the situation that happened with the American Airlines, you know, when crisis moments happen, they inevitably respond with a plan, they respond with the chief diversity officer, and it's organizations across sectors, right? Whether you're talking corporate, not-for-profit, collegiate, K through 12, it's almost like everybody got the same playbook, but they forgot something in the playbook. They forgot the air, right?
Yeah.
They forgot the air, right? And so the thing that I say is that diversity plans can't breathe without air. Accountability, incentives, infrastructure, and resources. Accountability, incentives, infrastructure, and resources. That's right, say it together.
Yeah.
Accountability, incentives,
infrastructure,
and
and
resources.
resources.
That's right. And so can't breathe without air. And so when we did the Diversity Plans Can't Breathe Without Air webinar, I was amazed. So I had like 1,100 persons that registered for it. But when we started double clicking in and did some post-event analysis, our analysis estimates that we touched north of 10,000 people, because people were hosting listening parties and activation parties and events around the webinar. And so it is probably the greatest honor for any leader to be able to be connected and to be a part of something. And that's what my life has always been about, whether it was as a student leader at 15 years old, all the way up through to today, and the chance to use digital tools, a digital platform to create an online experience. To say that it's the fulfillment of a life vision and a hope is probably an understatement. But I'm excited about the journey and just very humble and thankful that folks are willing to be a part of that journey with me.
So I have here in my hand 2 of your books, Strategic Diversity Leadership, Activating Change and Transformation in Higher Education, and The Chief Diversity Officer. I know in Strategic Diversity and Leadership, you talk about a cheetah and a wolf, and I see you're wearing a wolf pen right now, so I would love to know more about that.
Sure, so you caught that. Yeah, so in the book, one of the theories that I created was I talked about this idea of diversity crisis and how there's these diversity crises that happen on our campus. So, you know, it could happen when there's a very racialized, racist theme party that happens where perhaps students are minstreling African Americans or minstreling immigrant communities or minstreling poverty or hip hop or whatever it is. And they've got the blackface and the teeth and all kinds of stuff. And then the campus then responds with this hotbed moment as students start mobilizing, there's protests and all types of things happen. And in the 21st century, social media, what's gonna happen, right? Somebody's gonna have their camera out, right? So they're capturing the feed, they may be live streaming. So now instances that have been happening for decades, right? That were once private, now those instances are no longer private, right? Now those instances become something for the world to comment on, right? You get hashtag campaigns, you get all types of different dynamics that are happening. And I refer to these scenarios as cheetah moments, right? So cheetah moment, you're probably like, what is a cheetah moment, right? So a cheetah moment is when a diversity crisis scenario happens. And there's 2 different ways that an institution can respond. They can respond like a cheetah, or they can respond like a wolf. And so the cheetah will sit high on the plain in the Serengeti, waiting for the antelope, waiting for their prey, whatever it is, and the cheetah will go hurtling after it, right? So able to reach their top speed of 75 miles per hour for about 300 meters. Then, once they've accomplished their goal or not, they then go back and they go, and they reset, and they wait for another opportunity to run when another prey comes. They generally are hunting individually, sometimes in pairs, but generally individually, but it's not collective, it's not group, it's not relentless, it's not over time. It is simply one burst of energy and then it's over. What I found is that too often organizations approach their diversity and inclusion agenda in response to these moments like the cheetah and not like the wolf. Now, by comparison, the wolf moves collectively. The wolf can move not across 300 meters, the wolf can move relentlessly across 3 days. The wolf is found in all types of environments in the world, in the mountains, in the plains, in the desert. You can find the wolf anywhere, in snow. The cheetah has a very narrow ecosystem. So the wolf is incredibly dynamic where everybody from the alpha to the omega in the pack plays a role in the collective survival and health of the pack. And so my thought was, wow, what if institutions approach their diversity and inclusion agendas from a more wolf-like orientation rather than a cheetah-like orientation? So they don't just look and say, oh, it's the chief diversity officer's job. Or they just look and say, oh, we're just gonna have this one little initiative, or oh, we're gonna just do this over here. But what if you were approaching it where you created a context because there was accountability where everybody was playing a role in terms of the diversity strategy, where you built an infrastructure where there was not just a chief diversity officer, but you had an infrastructure that was connected like this, it was connected like that, and there was energy that was happening all the way around. And that's why we created the Inclusive Excellence Leadership Academy. Like I said earlier, it's about creating a space for leaders to level up and to become even stronger as Jedis, leveraging wolf-like energy to move the agenda at their institutions. And so I am wearing the wolf because I am trying to be wolf-like in my energy. And also, it's a subtle shout out to Game of Thrones. I'm a big Game of Thrones fan, so I am House Stark, and so I'm trying not to lose my head though, but I am House Stark, and so I'm a big fan of that show as well.
Okay, well, yeah, I think we could all be a bit more wolf-like in our approach. So tell me how your books here relate to your idea of about the Centennial Generation,
Yes.
development of preparing the Centennial Generation for leadership.
Sure. So, of course, everyone's been talking for years about the millennials. Well,
right.
The millennials are getting a little long in the tooth now, and there's a new generation kind of coming behind them because, candidly, there's very little in common from a generational perspective from someone who was born in the early 80s, which is generally where we talk about the millennials, and someone who was born in the late 90s and definitely into the 2000s. And so we have really kind of crested into a new moment where we have another generation that has come behind the millennials. Some refer to them as Gen Z, the we generation, the selfie generation, the app generation, lots of different namings. I prefer the term the Centennials, and I wrote a piece not too long ago titled Voice, Choice, Access, and Passion, How We Prepare Centennials for Leadership. And so when I was with Boys and Girls Clubs of America, we were working with the Centennial Generation of this country. And so inside of it, I really got a deep understanding of who the Centennial Generation is, right? They're not just digital native, they're what we refer to as digital intuitive, right? So the millennials, by comparison, they know a time when they didn't have data on their phone, right?
Yeah, I remember
right?
that.
You can remember it, right?
Yes.
They remember a time where there wasn't Wi-Fi or 3G and 4G. The Centennials, they look at their phone, if there's no picture there, the phone is broke, right? So it's a different way of engaging, and there's benefits to that, and there's challenges to that. The research that I was a part of, Centennials are consuming as much as 9 hours of digital content a day. They're constantly connected, and girls in particular are constantly on Instagram, they're constantly on Snapchat, and Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, YouTube, all mean something different. So when we start talking about the Centennials, you have to understand the digital platforms in which they engage, what they mean. And when you're engaged in those visual platforms of Snapchat and Instagram, you're constantly doing this, right? You're constantly right swiping. And one of the things I always say is that comparison is the thief of happiness. Let me say that again. Comparison is the thief of happiness. So what happens is as you're constantly comparing inside of those digital platforms, you're comparing your life to someone else's. And that, I believe, is what's driving the very high increase that we're seeing in terms of depression in this Centennial Generation, in terms of individuals having what's referred to as Facebook depression or social media depression. And it's connected to this idea of constantly comparing. The other thing we've come to understand is that social media is addictive.
Right.
And whenever you get that like, whenever you post something, and someone responds, you're getting that hit of dopamine, right? And so there's an addictive dynamic to it as well. When we start talking about the Centennial Generation, then we're talking about a generation where you have to understand who they are digitally. You have to understand that they're the most diverse generation in the history of this country, not only in terms of race and ethnicity, on our way to being a majority minority country, but also too in terms of sexuality. They are the first generation to say, we're not gonna live in closeted lives. We're gonna openly express who we are from a sexuality perspective. They are embracing and excuse me, sorry about that. They're embracing an intersectionality, right, of race and sexuality in ways that are very unique and different. And so when we start talking about the Centennials, all those things come to play. And then last and definitely not least, this is another generation. So the Xers, which is where I am, the Xers, the Millennials, and then now the Centennials are all generations of hip hop. So hip hop is the most strongly consumed genre of music and pop culture, right? And as a result, it shapes a lot. But yet, at the same time, as I said at the top of the interview, these communities of young people are still being educated and they're living in segregated environments. So they're not having a lot of primary discussions about race and primary discussions about difference, but they're constantly consuming hip-hop content through the 24/7, 365 reality TV world we live in. And so when I talk about preparing the Centennials for leadership, what I'm talking about is how do we start creating educational moments where students have to think about their privilege, think about their identity, understand not just how to put a nasty gram out there, but how to have a dialogue, right? Our students show up on campus and they know how to debate, think First Take. Think Uninterrupted, think ABC's The View, think Fox, think CNN, think Hawk and Dove, Blue and Red, R&D. All we're doing is this. But what we've got to do, if we're truly trying to create a democratic, connected society, we got to create moments where the students are learning how to dialogue, they're learning how to respectfully understand one another, and then they're learning how to have interaction around hot and difficult topics so that ultimately they can live and lead and collaborate in a world that's diverse, global, and interconnected. So we talk about that in the academy, we talk about that in the books, and it's been a major part of what shaped my career over the last 15 years.
Okay, well, the next thing I want to get into is I understand you believe in a more evidence-based approach to diversity. So tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, it probably was born by seeing so many leaders that were just out doing stuff. It was like I was at this institution or that institution, and they have these experiences, and the entirety of their leadership as a president or a provost or even a chief diversity officer or a dean was driven by what they had experienced. So if they were at an institution and the chief diversity officer was structured this way, that's the way they did it now. If they were at an institution and this is how they approached faculty diversification, that's how they do it now. Versus saying, hey, we have 3 generations of scholars that have built an incredible contribution of research and evidence about what works, about what doesn't work. And so my approach and the approach that we're trying to leverage in the academy, and also as I move around the country and work with different institutions, is an evidence-based approach. So I'm not going to suggest something for you that's not grounded in the theory, the research, the empiricism, the evidence. And we want for the approaches we're taking to be more evidence-based because we believe that that is going to be what breaks you through to get different types of results over time.
Okay, well, it's certainly been a pleasure speaking with you today, and I feel like even though we grew up in different parts of the world, we've experienced a lot of similar issues in terms of education, diversity, and inclusion. One more thing I do want to ask before we wrap is, I know you've been, on the record as stating that diversity in our faculty has been very challenging. And what are some of the things that leaders today can do? What are some of the challenges we face, and how can we try to overcome them?
Wow, it's a great question to end on.
What's the solution?
Yeah, probably the challenge that I've seen across the board that's been most shared, right? So it's shared at community colleges, it's shared at the most selective Ivy League institutions, public institutions, private, kind of the whole ecosystem of higher ed, is they're struggling with respect to faculty diversity. And a lot of folks will blame it on the pipeline, meaning that there's no candidates to go into those faculty diversity roles that are underrepresented minorities or women in STEM or women in business and finance and different types of areas. And hear me when I say this, a part of that is true, right? I'm not gonna say that the pipeline is so robust, but it's also based on some fallacies. It's based on this notion that institutions are proactively recruiting the candidates that are there. It's based on the fallacies that institutions are able to accurately see who these candidates are it's based in the fallacy that there's not unconscious bias or just bias that happens in selection. And so when I say it's a shared issue and a challenge, it is. But the solution, and what I think is important, is number one, we have to move from a perspective of not just screening diverse candidates to recruiting diverse candidates. So for example, it is the summer of what? It's the summer of LeBron. You didn't know? So everybody's recruiting LeBron James this summer, right? Recruiting every team in the nation, right, wants to recruit LeBron James. He is being recruited. How many times are diverse faculty members who maybe you're the only Latina female with a PhD in physics in the country, or you're one of 50 in the country, or you're one of yes, maybe small group, but are you being recruited? Absolutely not, you're not. And in those fields where maybe there is a more robust pipeline, like in education or in social work, those candidates still aren't being highly recruited, even when they've done all the right things.
Right.
And so I think if there's one thing that I would say is how do we shift the mindset and the strategic approach to move away from just screening to actually proactively recruiting. And we, of course, wrote all about that. We talk about it extensively in the Inclusive Excellence Leadership Academy.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Williams,
Yes.
for being here. It was a pleasure
Oh, it's a
speaking
real
with you
pleasure.
today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you
having
so
me.
much.
No, glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
you.